October 2, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The convoy rolled through the main gate just after dawn. 40 trucks, canvas sides drawn tight, engines rumbling in the dust. Inside sat 200 German soldiers captured 6 weeks earlier in the bloody chaos of the Falaise pocket. Most were young, all were exhausted, and every single one expected the worst. As the trucks slowed near the processing barracks, the prisoners caught their first glimpse of America beyond the wire. What they saw stopped their whispered conversations cold. Across the flat Texas horizon, dozens of smokestacks pierced the sky. A massive aluminum plant sprawled across 200 acres, its parking lots filled with hundreds of cars. Workers streamed out in waves as the morning shift ended, thousands of them, moving like clockwork through gates wide enough to swallow entire city blocks. The hum of machinery carried for miles. To men who had spent the last year dodging bombs and watching German factories crumble under Allied air raids, the sight seemed impossible. This was supposed to be the enemy's homeland, a nation bleeding resources, stretched thin across 2 oceans, barely holding on. Instead, they were staring at industrial power on a scale they had never imagined. Within 3 weeks, these prisoners would see it up close. Under the Geneva Convention, captured soldiers could be assigned to work details provided the labor wasn't military in nature, and America needed workers, badly. So the Germans were sent out in groups to sawmills, canning plants, rail depots, and machine shops. What they witnessed there wasn't propaganda. It wasn't exaggeration. It was the cold, overwhelming truth of American industry, a system so vast it could replace a destroyed bomber in 4 days, a lost tank in 12 hours, and still feed its own army while supplying half the free world. For soldiers who had believed in German superiority, who had trusted that willpower and discipline could overcome any disadvantage, the revelation was shattering. They had marched into war, believing they served the strongest nation on earth. Now, standing on foreign soil, staring at factories that never slept, they began to understand why they had lost. This is the story of what happened when German prisoners of war saw American industry firsthand and realized the war had been over long before they surrendered. June 1944, Normandy, France. The Battle of Normandy shattered the Wehrmacht in the west. By the time Allied forces closed the Falaise pocket in late August, over 150,000 German soldiers had been captured. They overwhelmed, holding camps across France. Food ran short, medical supplies dwindled, and the logistics of guarding that many prisoners stretched British and American forces to the breaking point. The solution was radical but necessary: ship them across the Atlantic, to America. Between 1943 and 1945, over 425,000 German POWs arrived on U.S. soil. They were distributed across 511 camps in 46 states, from Texas to Michigan, Nebraska to California. The numbers alone made it the largest prisoner resettlement program in history. For the Wehrmacht soldiers packed into Liberty ships for the crossing, the journey west felt like exile. Many believed they would never see home again. Some thought they were being taken to remote labor camps deep in the wilderness. Others, fed years of Nazi propaganda about American brutality, expected starvation and abuse. What they found was something entirely different. U.S. Army records from Camp McCain in Mississippi describe the moment prisoners first entered the facility. Guards directed them through processing medical checks, identification photos, uniform exchanges. Then they were led to barracks. Clean barracks, with bunks, mattresses, and heating. Mess halls served 3 meals a day. There were even canteens where prisoners could buy small luxuries using token wages earned from work details. One officer from the 21st Panzer Division later recalled the confusion. "We kept waiting for the cruelty to begin, but it never came. We ate better than we had in France. The beds were softer than anything we'd slept on in 2 years." It made perfect sense if you understood the American approach. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention and intended to follow it to the letter. Mistreating prisoners served no strategic purpose, but more than that, America didn't need to break them, it just needed to use them. Labor shortages had crippled agriculture and industry across the South and Midwest. Millions of American men were overseas. Factories ran double shifts trying to keep up with war production. Farms couldn't find enough hands to bring in harvests. The German POWs represented a ready workforce, and under Article 27 of the Geneva Convention, captured soldiers could be assigned to non-military labor, so they were put to work, and that's when everything changed. Because work details didn't just keep the prisoners busy, they gave them a window into the American war machine, and what they saw there shook them to their core. September 1944. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Hans Müller stood in the morning formation, waiting for his name to be called. He was 23 years old, a former lance corporal in the 116th Panzer Division. Captured near Cayenne, processed through England, shipped to New York, then rail transferred south to Alabama. 3 months ago, he'd been firing a machine gun at American tanks. Now he was about to be assigned to a work crew. The American sergeant read off assignments in broken German: 15 men to the sawmill, 20 to the cotton gin, 12 to the rail depot. Müller's group 30 prisoners would head to a food processing plant 5 miles from camp. They loaded into trucks and drove through the Alabama countryside. What struck Müller first wasn't the plant itself. It was everything around it: paved roads stretching in every direction, telephone lines strung between poles that marched toward the horizon, trucks, dozens of them lined up in neat rows, waiting to be loaded, and then the plant itself came into view. It was enormous, 3 stories tall, covering an area larger than most German military bases Müller had seen. Smokestacks pumped steam into the clear morning sky. Conveyor belts moved crates through loading bays. Workers in clean uniforms operated machinery that processed, canned, and packaged food at speeds that seemed impossible. Müller and his fellow prisoners were assigned to the loading dock. Their job was simple: move canned goods from the factory floor to waiting trucks. It should have been mindless work. But Müller couldn't stop watching the operation around him. Every 12 minutes, a new truck pulled up. Workers loaded it with precisely 240 crates, each containing 48 cans. Then it drove off, replaced immediately by another truck. The rhythm never varied. The flow never stopped. During the lunch break, Müller asked one of the American supervisors a question through an interpreter. How many cans did this plant produce per day? The supervisor checked his clipboard. Yesterday? About 82,000. Müller blinked. Per day. Per day. That night, back in the barracks, Müller did the math. 82,000 cans, from one plant, in one day. He tried to calculate how many plants like this existed across America. Then he stopped, because the numbers became absurd. Germany's entire wartime food production system, farms, processing centers, distribution networks had struggled to feed the Wehrmacht and the civilian population. Rationing had started in 1939 and grown tighter every year. By 1944, German soldiers were surviving on reduced rations, and civilians were eating ersatz bread made with sawdust filler. And here was one American factory, in one small Alabama town, producing enough canned food in a single day to feed a division for a week. Müller lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since his capture, a thought crept into his mind that he couldn't shake. What if we never had a chance? Late 1944. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Among the German prisoners at Camp Clinton was Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a production officer who had served in the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production before being drafted and sent to France. Weber wasn't a frontline soldier. He was an engineer, a logistics specialist, someone who understood supply chains, output quotas, and industrial capacity. When American intelligence officers learned of Weber's background, they requested an interview. Not an interrogation, an interview. They wanted to understand what Germany had known about American industrial strength before the war. Weber sat across from a U.S. Army major in a small office at Camp Clinton. The major spread several documents across the table: production reports, output statistics, factory surveys, all declassified, all accurate. "I want to show you something," the major said. He slid a single-page summary toward Weber. "This is U.S. aircraft production for 1944. Weber looked at the numbers, then looked again, then asked for the page to be translated more carefully, because surely he had misunderstood. 96,000 aircraft, built in 1 year. The major watched Weber's face. "You don't believe it." "I cannot believe it," Weber replied quietly. "Germany produced approximately 40,000 aircraft in 1944. We thought that was remarkable. We were told America was struggling to match even half that number." The major pulled out another sheet. "Tanks, 29,000 in 1943 alone." Weber said nothing. His hands were shaking slightly. The major continued, his tone neither gloating nor cruel, simply factual. "Liberty ships. We launched one every 3.5 days, 71,000 ships total by the end of the war. Ammunition over 40 billion rounds annually. Trucks 2.4 million. Weber stared at the papers spread before him. As a production officer, he understood what these numbers meant. They weren't just statistics. They were the hard mathematics of industrial war, and those mathematics told a story Germany had refused to see. "We believed," Weber said slowly, "that American industry was soft, that your workers were undisciplined, that your factories could not match German engineering or efficiency. We were told this by our leaders." "We believed it because we wanted to believe it." The major leaned back. "And now," Weber looked up, meeting his eyes. "Now I understand that we never fought your army. We fought your factories. And we lost that battle before the first shot was fired." January 1945, Willow Run, Michigan. A select group of German POWs, chosen for their technical backgrounds and cooperative attitudes, were assigned to maintenance work at the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant. It was a calculated decision by U.S. intelligence. These prisoners would see American production capability firsthand, carry that knowledge back to their barracks, and spread the word among their fellow POWs. What they saw at Willow Run defied comprehension. The factory was a single building 1 mile long. Inside, assembly lines stretched the entire length, and B-24 Liberator bombers rolled off those lines at a rate of 1 per hour. Not 1 per day. 1 per hour. The plant operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In peak production months, Willow Run alone produced more bombers than Germany's entire aircraft industry. Heinz Schmidt, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, was among the prisoners assigned to clean and maintain equipment on the factory floor. He had worked on German aircraft production lines before the war and thought he understood industrial manufacturing. Willow Run shattered that understanding. German factories built planes one at a time, with skilled craftsmen assembling each aircraft from thousands of individual parts. It was precise, it was efficient by European standards, but it was slow. Willow Run worked differently. The assembly line moved continuously. Workers didn't build planes, they installed components. Each station performed one specific task, repeated endlessly. Engines mounted here, wings attached there, electrical systems installed at the next station. By the time a fuselage reached the end of the line, it was a complete aircraft, fueled, armed, and ready to fly. Schmidt watched a bomber roll off the line, get towed to the testing area, and take off within 6 hours. 6 hours from completion to combat-ready flight. In Germany, that process took weeks. During a break, Schmidt asked his American supervisor a question. "How many of these do you build?" The supervisor checked his watch. "Today, we'll finish 18 by midnight. Tomorrow we're aiming for 20. Schmidt felt something crack inside him. Not his loyalty that had died somewhere in France, but his understanding of the war itself. He had believed Germany was losing because of bad leadership, poor strategy, or Allied numerical superiority. Those explanations let him preserve some dignity, some sense that Germany had fought well but been overwhelmed by circumstances. Now he understood the truth. Germany hadn't been overwhelmed by circumstances. Germany had been crushed by capacity, by an industrial system so vast, so efficient, and so relentless that no amount of German discipline or battlefield skill could ever have overcome it. That night, Schmidt returned to Camp Clinton and told the other prisoners what he had seen. Some didn't believe him, others called him a traitor for accepting American propaganda. But more and more, the prisoners were coming to the same conclusion on their own. The war was lost. It had always been lost. They just hadn't known it. The numbers kept piling up. And the prisoners kept calculating. One American factory could replace the aircraft losses from an entire month of Luftwaffe operations in less than a week. A single shipyard produced more tonnage in 6 months than the Kriegsmarine had built in 5 years. The tanks destroyed in Normandy were replaced before the next offensive began. Germany could fight. Germany could resist. But Germany could not replace. And in a war of attrition, replacement was everything. March 1945. Nebraska. Not all prisoner work details involved factories. In the Midwest, thousands of German POWs were assigned to agricultural labor. America's farmland had emptied as young men joined the military, and without workers to plant and harvest, the nation's food supply and the supply lines feeding Allied forces overseas would collapse. So the Germans were sent to the fields. For many prisoners, farm work seemed like a reprieve. It was outdoors. It was away from guards. It felt less like captivity and more like labor they understood. But even here, on the open plains of Nebraska, the reality of American power became impossible to ignore. Kurt Becker was 26 years old, a former farmhand from Bavaria. He had grown up working his family's small farm, ploughing fields behind a horse, harvesting wheat by hand. When he was assigned to agricultural work in Nebraska, he expected something familiar. What he found was mechanization beyond anything he had imagined. The farm he was sent to covered 12,000 acres. 12,000. Becker's family farm in Bavaria had been 40 acres, and that was considered large by German standards. This Nebraska farm was 300 times bigger, and it was worked by fewer than 30 people. How? Machines. Tractors pulled plows that turned soil in hours, not days. Combines harvested wheat faster than Becker could walk. Trucks hauled grain to silos in a single trip that would have taken his family weeks with a horse-drawn cart. Everything was mechanized. Everything was scaled. But what truly stunned Becker wasn't the machinery itself. It was the fuel. In Germany, fuel shortages had crippled agriculture by 1943. Tractors sat unused because there was no gasoline. Horses were reintroduced on many farms because diesel was reserved for military vehicles. Here in Nebraska, fuel was everywhere. Tractors ran all day. Trucks made dozens of trips. Generators powered irrigation pumps and grain dryers. The farm didn't ration fuel. It used fuel the way Becker's family had used water. During a lunch break, Becker asked the farm owner, an older man named John Pritchard, how he got so much gasoline. Pritchard looked confused by the question. "I buy it." "From the station in town?" "Why?" "In Germany," Becker said carefully, "fuel is controlled, rationed. You cannot simply buy it." Pritchard nodded slowly. "Well, we got plenty of oil here. Texas, Oklahoma, California, pumping thousands of barrels a day." Becker didn't respond. He couldn't. The implications were too vast. Germany's war machine had run on synthetic fuel produced in factories that Allied bombers destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Every gallon of gasoline was precious. Every litre of diesel was rationed. Germany's tanks, planes, and trucks moved only when absolutely necessary, because fuel was always scarce. America wasn't rationing fuel. America was drowning in it. Pumping it from the ground, refining it in massive plants, distributing it so freely that a farmer in Nebraska could fill his tractor without a second thought. That night, lying in his bunk at the camp, Becker thought about the war. About the offensives that had stalled because fuel convoys couldn't reach the front. About the Luftwaffe planes grounded not by damage, but by empty tanks. about the panzer divisions that had fought brilliantly until they ran out of gasoline and were destroyed where they stood. Germany had fought with discipline and courage, but discipline couldn't create fuel, courage couldn't refine oil, and without fuel, all the tanks and planes in the world were just expensive scrap metal. April 1945. Various POW camps across the United States. As the war in Europe entered its final weeks, American intelligence ramped up prisoner interrogations. Not to extract tactical information, the battlefield situation made that irrelevant, but to understand the German mindset. To learn what the Wehrmacht had known, what they had believed, and how they had miscalculated so catastrophically. The transcripts from these interrogations, preserved in the National Archives, reveal a consistent pattern. Disbelief, turning to analysis, denial giving way to understanding. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, a captured artillery officer named Major Klaus Hoffmann was asked about German intelligence assessments of American industry before the war. "We believed you were strong," Hoffmann said, "but not overwhelming. Our intelligence reports estimated American aircraft production at 20,000 per year, tank production at perhaps 8,000. We thought those numbers gave you an advantage, but not an insurmountable one." The interrogator showed Hoffmann the actual figures: 96,000 aircraft in 1944, 29,000 tanks in 1943. Hoffmann stared at the papers for a long time. Then he said quietly, "We were lied to. Or our intelligence services were incompetent. Or both." "Why do you think Germany underestimated us?" the interrogator asked. Hoffmann's answer was blunt, because accepting the truth would have meant accepting that the war was unwinnable, and that was a thought no one in Berlin could allow. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, another officer, a logistics coordinator who had served in the Quartermaster Corps, described the moment his perspective shifted. "I was assigned to work at a rail depot," he explained. "My job was to help load supply trains. In 3 days, I watched more material move through that one depot than I had seen flow through all of Germany in a month. Food, medicine, equipment, fuel. It never stopped. And I realized, this is just one depot, in one state, in one country. How many more like this exist? Hundreds? Thousands?" He paused, then continued. "In Germany, we celebrated when a supply convoy reached the front intact. Here, supply convoys are routine, expected, unremarkable. That is the difference between us. We struggled to sustain. You thrived without effort." The pattern repeated across dozens of camps. Officers with engineering backgrounds calculated tonnage and output rates. Logistics experts analyzed shipping capacity and production cycles. Even frontline soldiers, with no technical training, began to see the mathematical inevitability of defeat. One sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division summed it up simply. "You did not beat us on the battlefield. You buried us in steel." By the spring of 1945, the truth had spread through nearly every POW camp in America. The Germans weren't just losing the war. They had never had a realistic chance of winning it. Not because German soldiers weren't brave, not because German tactics weren't effective, but because industrial capacity decided modern wars, and America's capacity was so vast, it rendered everything else irrelevant. The prisoners had seen it with their own eyes, and they couldn't unsee it. February 1945. Richmond, California. The Kaiser shipyards at Richmond were one of the most productive industrial sites in human history. Between 1941 and 1945, they built 747 ships. That's an average of 1 ship every 2 days for 4 years straight. A small group of German POWs selected for maintenance and welding work were brought to the shipyards under heavy guard. US intelligence wanted them to see it, wanted them to carry the story back, wanted every German prisoner to understand what they were up against. The prisoners arrived at dawn and stood at the edge of the yard, staring. 15 slipways stretched along the waterfront. On each slipway sat a Liberty ship in various stages of construction. Cranes lifted prefabricated hull sections into place. Welders worked in coordinated teams, sealing seams with precision. Electrical crews ran wiring through bulkheads. In the distance, a newly completed ship slid down the rails into the water, launched after just 8 days of assembly. 8 days. From keel to launch. 8 days. One of the prisoners, a naval engineer named Lieutenant Stefan Richter, had served in the Kriegsmarine before being reassigned to a land unit in France. He knew ships. He understood shipbuilding timelines. German yards took 6 months to build a U-boat. Capital ships took years. Richter walked closer to one of the slipways, watching the workers move in choreographed efficiency. An American supervisor, noticing his interest, approached with an interpreter. "You build ships?" the supervisor asked. Richter nodded. "I worked at the Blom und Voss yards in Hamburg." "Good yard," the supervisor said, surprising Richter with his knowledge. "They build quality vessels." "Yes," Richter agreed. "But slowly. A destroyer takes 18 months. A cruiser, 3 years. The supervisor gestured toward the slipway. "This one here will launch next Tuesday. Started it last Thursday." Richter blinked. 10 days? 8, actually. We lost a day to weather. Richter did the math in his head. 8 days, 15 slipways. If each slipway produced a ship every 8 days, that meant Richmond alone could build 68 ships per month. 68, in 1 yard, per month. Germany's entire shipbuilding industry, every yard, every slipway, every worker had built approximately 1,000 U-boats over the entire course of the war. It had taken 5 years. Richmond alone could match that in less than 18 months. "How many yards like this does America have?" Richter asked quietly. The supervisor thought for a moment. "Kaiser operates 6 yards on the West Coast. Then there's the East Coast yards, Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Bath Iron Works. Gulf Coast has a bunch too, maybe 50 major yards total, plus hundreds of smaller facilities building smaller craft." Richter felt something inside him collapse. 50 major yards, hundreds of smaller ones, all building at this pace. All supplied with unlimited steel, unlimited fuel, unlimited workers. That night, back at the camp, Richter wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. The letter was intercepted and read by camp censors standard procedure, but they let it through because it contained no sensitive information. Just one man's attempt to explain the unexplainable. "We are not losing this war because of cowardice or betrayal," he wrote. "We are losing because we challenged a nation that builds ships faster than we can sink them, planes faster than we can shoot them down, and tanks faster than we can destroy them. We fought bravely. But bravery cannot defeat mathematics." Late April 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. News reached the camps in fragments. First, that Berlin was surrounded, then that Hitler was dead. Finally, on May 8th, the announcement that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. For many prisoners, the news brought relief. The war was over. They would eventually go home. The killing would stop. But for others, the surrender crystallized a realization that had been building for months. Germany hadn't just lost a war. Germany had fought an unwinnable war, and its leaders had either known this and sent men to die anyway, or had been so deluded they genuinely believed victory was possible. In the barracks at Camp Shelby, a group of prisoners gathered to discuss the news. Among them was Hans Müller, the same corporal who had worked at the Alabama canning plant months earlier. "I kept thinking we would turn it around," one soldier said. "I thought the V weapons would change everything, or the new jet fighters, or the final offensive in the Ardennes." "Wunderwaffen," another prisoner said bitterly. "Wonder weapons. We were told to have faith in wonder weapons while America built 10,000 normal weapons." Müller spoke up. "It was never about the weapons. We lost because they could replace losses and we couldn't. I saw it in Alabama, one factory producing 80,000 cans of food per day. How do you fight that? You can't bomb it fast enough. You can't disrupt it fast enough. It just keeps producing." An older officer, a captain who had fought in France, added his perspective. "I commanded a panzer company in Normandy. We destroyed 15 American tanks in one engagement. 15. We thought it was a great victory. But 2 days later, those Americans came back with 20 new tanks, not repaired tanks, new tanks, shipped from America. Meanwhile, we were still waiting for spare parts for our damaged vehicles. The conversation continued late into the night, and a consensus emerged, not spoken aloud, but understood by all. Germany had been doomed from the moment it went to war with America. All the courage, all the tactical brilliance, all the sacrifice had been for nothing. Because in a war of industrial attrition, Germany never had enough, and America had more than enough for everyone. The prisoners began to understand something historians would later confirm. World War II in Europe wasn't decided by a single battle, or a brilliant strategy, or a charismatic leader. It was decided by production tables and shipping manifests and factory output reports. Germany produced 40,000 aircraft in 1944. America produced 96,000. Germany built 6,000 tanks in 1943. America built 29,000. Germany's entire industrial output for the war totaled roughly 200 billion Reichsmarks. America's exceeded $800 billion, 4 times as much. The numbers told the story. And the prisoners, having seen the source of those numbers firsthand, finally understood. Late 1945 into 1946. Repatriation to Germany. The first groups of POWs began returning to Germany in late 1945. By 1946, the repatriation was in full swing. Thousands of men, released from American camps, shipped back across the Atlantic to a homeland they barely recognized. Germany was destroyed. Cities lay in ruins, factories were rubble, infrastructure had collapsed. Millions were dead or missing. The country had been divided between Allied occupation zones, its government dissolved, its military disbanded. The returning prisoners brought with them stories that seemed impossible to those who had remained in Germany. Stories of American factories that ran 24 hours a day, of farms larger than entire German districts, of shipyards that built vessels faster than Germany had ever imagined possible. Many families didn't believe them, thought they were exaggerating, figured they'd been deceived by propaganda during their captivity. But the prisoners insisted, and slowly their accounts spread. In beer halls and town squares, in letters and conversations, the truth about American industrial power filtered through post-war Germany. And something unexpected happened. The stories didn't breed resentment, they bred determination. Friedrich Weber, the production officer who had been interviewed at Camp Clinton, returned to Germany in early 1946. He found work with a rebuilding program in the British occupation zone, helping to restart manufacturing in the Ruhr Valley. He brought with him detailed notes on American factory layouts, assembly line techniques, and quality control processes. "We must learn from this," he told his colleagues. "We lost the war because we fell behind industrially. If Germany is to recover, we must modernize. We must adopt the methods I saw in America." Stefan Richter, the naval engineer from the Hamburg shipyards, had a similar experience. He returned to find the Blom und Voss yards damaged but salvageable. When reconstruction began, Richter pushed for American-style prefabrication techniques and assembly line processes. "I saw them build a ship in 8 days, he explained to skeptical foremen. 8 days. We can't match that speed, but we can learn from their efficiency." All across West Germany, former POWs became engineers, factory managers, and industrial planners. They carried with them a hard-earned education in American methods, and they applied those lessons to rebuilding their shattered nation. Historians later identified this as one of the hidden factors in West Germany's rapid post-war recovery. The Marshall Plan provided the money, Allied support provided the stability, but the knowledge of American industrial practices carried home by 400,000 prisoners who had seen it firsthand provided the blueprint. The statistics from American war production remain staggering even decades later. They represent not just industrial output, but a fundamental transformation of how modern nations wage war. By the end of 1945, the United States had produced 297,000 aircraft of all types: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, enough to replace every plane lost in combat 7 times over, 88,000 tanks and armored vehicles, more tanks than Germany and the Soviet Union combined. 2.4 million trucks, enough to motorize every Allied army on every front simultaneously. 71,000 ships and landing craft. A merchant marine and amphibious fleet larger than all previous navies in history. 47 million tons of artillery shells and ammunition. Enough firepower to sustain continuous operations on multiple continents for years. The United States achieved this while maintaining civilian living standards that didn't decline significantly until very late in the war. German civilians faced severe rationing from 1939 onward. British civilians endured years of austerity. Soviet civilians starved. American civilians dealt with shortages of certain goods but never faced genuine hardship. To the German POWs who witnessed this, the contrast was almost incomprehensible. America was fighting a two-ocean war, supplying allies across the globe, building weapons and vehicles at unprecedented rates, and its civilian population still lived better than most Germans had lived even before the war started. Hans Müller, years after returning to Germany, gave an interview to a historian researching POW experiences. His summary was blunt. "We thought we were fighting a nation of farmers and shopkeepers. Instead, we fought a nation that could outproduce the entire world combined. That is why we lost. Not because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled, but because bravery and skill don't matter when the enemy can replace every loss you inflict within days. We could win battles. We could never win the war." The industrial disparity between Germany and America wasn't just a matter of scale. It was a matter of fundamentally different economic systems. Germany's war economy operated under a command structure that prioritized military production over civilian needs from the start. Factories were nationalized. Workers were conscripted, resources were rationed. The entire economy bent towards supporting the Wehrmacht, and it still couldn't match American output. America's war economy operated differently. Factories remained privately owned, though production was coordinated by government agencies. Workers were paid competitive wages, which kept morale high and productivity higher. Resources were abundant, sourced from domestic production and global trade networks. Most importantly, America didn't sacrifice civilian production to boost military production. Instead, American industry expanded. New factories were built. Existing facilities were enlarged. Production capacity grew so much that the nation could supply its military while still maintaining civilian consumption at near pre-war levels. Kurt Becker, the farmhand who had worked in Nebraska, understood this better than most after his return to Germany. He found work helping to restart agriculture in Bavaria, and often reflected on what he'd seen. "In Germany, we chose guns over butter," he said. "We sacrificed everything for the military. But in America, they had guns and butter. They didn't choose. They had both. That is the difference between a wealthy nation and a poor one. We pretended to be wealthy. They actually were." The lesson was clear. Industrial capacity didn't just win wars, it defined what kind of war you could fight. Germany fought a war of attrition it couldn't sustain. America fought a war of attrition it could sustain indefinitely. By the time German POWs saw American factories firsthand, the war was already over. They just hadn't realized it yet. Here's what the prisoners learned. Modern war isn't won by the bravest soldiers or the cleverest generals. It's won by factories, by supply chains, by the ability to produce weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel faster than the enemy can destroy them. Germany had brave soldiers, it had talented generals, but it didn't have enough factories, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The story of German POWs in America remains relatively unknown outside academic circles. Most histories of World War II focus on battles, strategies, and political decisions. The experience of captured soldiers, especially their first-hand observations of American industrial power, rarely gets mentioned. But for the men who lived it, the experience was transformative. Many POWs returned to Germany with a deep respect for American capability. Not affection, war creates hatreds that don't fade quickly, but respect, an understanding that they had faced an opponent unlike any in history. Some prisoners remained bitter, blamed their leaders for dragging Germany into an unwinnable war, resented the propaganda that had promised victory while hiding the truth about Allied strength. Others found a strange peace in what they'd learned. If the war was unwinnable from the start, then their defeat wasn't a personal failure. They had fought as well as anyone could. They had simply been beaten by an opponent that couldn't be beaten. Historians later conducting research on German POW experiences found that many former prisoners became advocates for European-American cooperation after the war. They pushed for trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual understanding. Having seen American power up close, they believed Germany's future lay in partnership, not rivalry. One former POW, interviewed in the 1970s, put it simply, "We learned that trying to fight America was madness. Better to work with them, learn from them. That way, we can rebuild what the war destroyed." That sentiment, multiplied across thousands of returning prisoners, helped shape West Germany's post-war orientation toward the West. The Marshall Plan succeeded partly because Germans were willing to accept American aid, and they were willing to accept it because so many had seen American capability firsthand and understood that cooperation was the only sensible path forward. October 2, 2025, 81 years after those first trucks rolled into Camp Swift, Texas. The story of German POWs in America is more than historical curiosity. It's a lesson in the nature of modern conflict, a reminder that wars between industrial powers aren't decided by courage or tactics alone. They're decided by capacity, by the ability to produce, supply, and sustain military force over time. The German soldiers who saw American factories understood this. They carried that understanding home, and in doing so, they helped ensure that the lessons of World War II weren't forgotten. Today, rusted remnants of POW camps still dot the American landscape. Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Clinton in Mississippi. Most are gone now, reclaimed by farmland or redeveloped into towns. But a few remain, preserved as historical sites. And if you visit them, you can stand where those German prisoners stood. Look across the Texas plains toward the industrial plants on the horizon. Imagine what it must have felt like to see that for the first time, to understand, suddenly and completely, why your nation lost the war. The prisoners who lived through it never forgot. They had marched into captivity as soldiers of the Third Reich. They returned home as witnesses to the industrial power that had broken their armies and reshaped the world. And in the end, that's what they told their children and grandchildren. We fought with everything we had. We believed in our cause. We gave our all on the battlefield. But we lost because we challenged a nation that could build faster than we could destroy. That replaced losses before we could exploit them. That fought not with desperation, but with abundance. We lost because we went to war with America's factories. And those factories never stopped. If this story of industrial power and wartime production fascinated you, there are dozens more untold stories from World War II waiting to be discovered. Consider subscribing to support more deep-dive historical content like this, and if you found this video valuable, please like and share it. History matters. Understanding how wars are really won matters even more. The next video explores another hidden aspect of World War II, the secret intelligence operations that cracked German codes and shortened the war by years. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. And remember, history isn't just about battles and generals. Sometimes it's about factories, supply chains, and the silent arithmetic of industrial war.